All right, Genesis 37, starting in verse 12. I'll just read the whole thing. I was going to read it in chunks, but I'll just read the whole thing. So then his brothers went to feed their father's flock in Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers feeding the flock in Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." So he said to him, "Here I am." Then he said to him, "Please go and see if it is well with your brothers and well with the flocks, and bring back word to me." So he sent him out of the valley of Hebron, and he went to Shechem. Now a certain man found him, and there he was, wandering in the field. And the man asked him, saying, "What are you seeking?" So he said, "I am seeking my brothers. Please tell me where they are feeding their flocks." And the man said, "They have departed from there, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan. Now when they had saw him afar off, even before he came near them, they conspired against him to kill him. Then they said to one another, "Look, this dreamer is coming. Come, therefore, let us now kill him and cast him into some pit, and we shall say, 'Some wild beast has devoured him.' We shall see what will become of his dreams." But Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands and said, "Let us not kill him." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood, but cast him into this pit which is in the wilderness, and do not lay a hand on him, that he might deliver him out of their hands and bring him back to his father." So it came to pass, when Joseph had come to his brothers, that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the tunic of many colors that was on him. Then they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty, there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat a meal. Then they lifted their eyes and looked, and there was a company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels, bearing spices, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry them down to Egypt. So Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh." And his brothers listened. Then Midianite traders passed by, so the brothers pulled Joseph up, lifted him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. Then Reuben returned to the pit. Indeed, Joseph was not in the pit, and he tore his clothes, and he returned to his brothers and said, "The lad is no more, and I, where shall I go?" So they took Joseph's tunic, killed a kid of the goats, and dipped the tunic in the blood. Then they sent the tunic of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, "We have found this. Do you know whether it is your son's tunic or not?" And he recognized it and said, "It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth on his waist, and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "For I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Now the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. Okay. I mean, we all know this story, right? You probably still remember the old flannel graph in the Sunday school rooms where they put the pictures of Joseph and his brother. Very well-known story. We all know this story. As we see here, Joseph sold into Egypt. But last time, as I said, we looked at the first 11 verses of chapter 37, and we're introduced to Joseph and his brothers. This is the last of the Toledotes in Genesis, or the last of the "these are the generations of" in Genesis, and it takes us from the patriarchs to Moses. This is the bridge from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to Moses, because by the end of Genesis, all of the sons of Israel, all of the tribe of the Hebrews are in Egypt, and then, of course, 400 years passes by, and then we're brought up to Moses. But we're introduced to these 12 brothers, these 12 sons of Joseph, or Jacob, and Joseph is among them, and he is, of course, the one of favored status, right? He is Jacob's favorite because he was his son of his old age. And now, as we see here, this is as I said, the story we all know very well, in which Joseph is cast into slavery. He's sold by his brothers into slavery and brought to Egypt. Now, all of this we're going to see is by God's providence, right? And we know this. This is God's providence working in and through the sin of Joseph's brothers to bring Joseph to Egypt in order to bring redemption for his people. All of this is to set up the salvation of Jacob and his family from the famine. And of course, all of it is to set up what we'll see later on is the greatest act of salvation in the Old Testament, which is the Exodus, which is itself a pointer to an even greater act of salvation that we will see in Jesus Christ, as Jesus Christ is a better Moses who leads us on a better Exodus. But all of this is part of God's plan, right? All of history is literally his story or God's story as he works in and through it. There are no coincidences here, as we'll see as we go through this. But we're going to look at this in 4 parts tonight. Joseph investigates, Joseph is captured, Joseph is sold, and Jacob mourns. Those are the 4 parts of this section that we see here. See, I'm not enslaved to 3 points. I can do 4 points. As the passage leads, right? I'm not tied to 3 points. Sometimes I have 2. Think about that. Are you thinking about that? No. All right, let's move on. All right, so first, Joseph investigates. Now, as I said last time, we were introduced to Joseph and his brothers, and the stage was set to bring Genesis to a close. What we see here in this passage is the events that God uses to bring Joseph from the land of promise to Egypt. Everything in this story, everything in this narrative is to bring Joseph from Canaan to Egypt. And it all begins, as we see here, with the brothers tending the flock, Jacob's flock in Shechem. Now, do you remember Shechem? Do you remember what happened at Shechem? Just think back like 3 or 4 chapters. What happens in Genesis 34?
Is that with the lady?
That's when Jacob's sister or daughter Dinah is raped by the Shechemites. So obviously Jacob's sons are able to tend the flock in Shechem, probably because all the Shechemites are gone, because Jacob's sons slaughtered most of them, if not all of them. So here they are. They're in a sense they're back at the scene of the crime, right? So they're here in Shechem, Jacob's sons, and they're tending his flock. Now, if you remember last time, what was Joseph's job in the first 11 chapters? He was the one keeping the sheep, right? Now, apparently, he's been elevated, he's been promoted, because if you remember last time, Joseph brought an ill report of his brothers. He kind of tattled on his brothers a little bit and said, hey, Dad, you know what Reuben and everyone else is doing? Let me tell you. And so Jacob elevates him and gives him this robe of many colors, or this tunic of long sleeves, this emblem of status as the favored son. So now apparently Joseph, who is the youngest or the second youngest, is now going around and keeping up on his brothers, right? So Jacob has elevated him to sort of like a supervisor or a foreman or a manager. So he says, he calls Joseph to himself and says, I'm going to send you to your brothers and see if it is well with them and if it is well with their flocks. Now, the word there, well, right? Well with your brothers and well with the flocks, that's the word shalom. So see if everything is peaceful with your brothers and everything is peaceful with the flocks. And he says, and then bring back word to me. So, he's putting a lot of responsibility on the young man here to check up on his brothers. Now, of course, Joseph, being the dutiful son, does what his father says. He says, I will do it. Say no more, Dad. I'm going to go and check things out and see what happens. And when he comes to Shechem, he doesn't find his brothers there. He starts wandering the fields. And it just so happens that a man sees Joseph there and says, what are you seeking? And he says, well, I'm looking for my brothers. And it just so happens that this man who happens to find Joseph there in the fields knows who his brothers are and where they went to. And he tells him, he's like, well, your brothers are no longer here. They're up in Dothan, which just so happens to be on a major caravan from Syria all the way down to Egypt. So, what an amazing set of coincidences, right? Do you believe that? No, of course not. All right, but he does find a man here And as I said, this man knows, Joseph just says, I'm looking for my brothers. Now, if it were me, I'd be like, and who are they? That'd be like me wandering around Sutton saying, hey, I'm looking for Greece. I'm like, which one? Which one are you looking for? But it's like, I'm looking for my brothers. Oh, I said, oh, yeah. Your brothers, right? You're Jacob's son, right? Well, they're up in Dothan. So he goes up to Dothan and checks up on him. So he goes there. So this is the first, 12 through 17. That's what I'm looking at here. And as I said, these opening verses where Joseph is investigating his brothers, it's setting the table for the rest of this passage here, right? Now, a few things stick out before we move on. The first is, why is Jacob sending Joseph to check up on his brothers? Does he not know how his brothers feel about Joseph? We know this from last time, right? Just on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you think Joseph's brothers feel about Joseph? 10 being, we love him. 1 being, let's throw him into a pit and sell him into slavery, okay? Where do you think their love for Joseph is at this point? A 1, right? Right? It's like when he had the dream initially, right? When he gave the bad report, it said that his brothers hated him. And then when he gave the dream that said, oh, and you're going to bow down to me, then it says, then they hated him even more. It's like, it's like their hatred for Joseph was turned up and dialed up to 11, right? Okay, they hated him. Why is Jacob doing this? Is Jacob oblivious? Does he not? Or does he think that his older sons, will somehow just leave Joseph alone because he's got his fancy look, multicolored robe on or something? I don't get it. If anything, the brothers have shown themselves to be very ruthless men, right? Their sister gets raped and they slaughter a whole town. 2 of them slaughter a whole town. These are not mild-mannered men. Let's just put it that way, okay? Second, we see here, it's interesting that Joseph is sent to check on the brothers' shalom, right? It says, go and see if it is well with your brothers. Go and see if your brothers are at shalom. And go and see if the flocks are at shalom. Keep this in mind for later, because if you remember last time, the brothers, it was told that they could not even greet him. And there it says they could not even say shalom to Joseph. That's how much they hated him. And of course, as I've been kind of teasing it out, notice the third thing to notice here is the Lord's hand of providence, okay? What are the odds that this dude finds Joseph wandering in a field? And what are the odds that he knows that Joseph's brothers were here and now they're up in Dothan, right? What if it's like 5 seconds later? What if Joseph, what if he turns one way and the other man doesn't see him? All kinds of things, all kinds of quote-unquote coincidences could be happening here. If, Joseph comes 5 minutes later, the man doesn't meet him. If Joseph comes 5 minutes earlier, the man misses him, right? All these things. This is all God's providence, right? Heidelberg, Lord's Day 10, question 27, God works and governs all things, right? Rain and good weather, feast and famine, poverty and riches, health and sickness, all things come not by chance, but by his fatherly hand. So here we see, again, a certain man just happens to appear at the right time just to see Joseph looking for his brothers. And they happen to be at Dothan, which just so happens, as I said, to be a major caravan route into Egypt. God is working even when we don't see it. You're not going to see God's name mentioned at all in chapter 37, but God's hands are all over it. God's hands are all over this chapter. Well, now in verses 18 through 24, Joseph is captured. Now, apparently, because his coat must be neon or something, because apparently he doesn't see the brothers, but the brothers see him, okay? So I don't know if that coat is like flashing, if it's kind of like, electric lights on it or something, but it says, now when they saw him from afar off, even before he came near them, they conspired against him to kill him. So, they hate him, right? We've already kind of played that out from last time. So they hate him, and they said to one another, look, this dreamer. If you have a footnote there, literally says this master or lord of dreams. It's Baal Ha-Halomoth, or master of dreams, or lord of dreams. In other words, they're mocking Joseph because of his dreams. It's like, let's see how his dreams come to pass when we take him and kill him, right? Because if we kill him, then there's no chance that we'll be bowing down to him, right? That's what their thinking is here, right? So they're like, let's take this Lord of Dreams, let's kill him, right? Come, therefore, let us now kill him, verse 20, and cast him into some pit, and we will say, some wild beast has devoured him. We shall see what will become of his dreams. But Reuben hears of it. And it says here, he delivered him out of their hands and said, let us not kill him. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood, but cast him into this pit, which is in the wilderness, and do not lay a hand on him. Now, do you think Reuben all of a sudden has come up with some newfound love for his younger brother Joseph? How many here think Reuben has found some newfound love for his younger brother Joseph? I am seeing 0 hands go up. Okay. What do you think Reuben's motivation here is?
Might be for his dad.
What's that?
Might be for his dad.
He's trying to get back into his dad's good graces. Remember early on, I think it's in chapter 35, we're told that Reuben slept with Jacob's concubines. Zilhah and Bilhah, I think are their names. That was not, oops. That was a power play. Okay, that was a power play, and Reuben is trying to take over by taking and sleeping with his dad's concubines. So here he's trying to get back into his good graces. And it says here, right, and the scripture here tells us that he might deliver him out of their hands and bring him back to his father. Again, no real love lost between Reuben and Joseph, and probably not as much affection between Reuben and his father Jacob either. But he did do something that ticked off his dad, and here he is trying to see if he can work his way out of it by saving Joseph. So he says, let's cast him into the pit, and then Reuben was going to come back later, rescue him, and say, who knows what he was going to say? Hey, your sons were going to kill your brother, but I saved him. Aren't I the good son? Right? That's kind of what we see going on here. So he's trying to get back into his dad's good graces. So Joseph approaches, and they spring into action. They take him, they seize him, they strip him of his robe, and they cast him into a pit. And apparently this was like a well or a cistern, because it says there was no water in the pit. And there he is. He's in this pit. They stripped him and cast him into the pit. Now, you would think that what Joseph's brothers here did to Joseph was unusual, right? Because as we all know, all of the families in the Bible typically get along very well, right? Or no, they don't, right? In fact, Genesis is littered with dysfunctional families. Cain kills Abel, right? Ishmael mocks Isaac. Esau and Jacob were at each other's throats. Jacob had deceived his brother Esau. Esau wanted to kill Jacob. No, this is very not unusual for the families in Genesis here. Joseph had dreamed that his brothers would bow down to him, and then because of that, Jacob elevated Joseph to essentially the status of the firstborn by giving him the tunic, by calling him the son of my old age. That's what Abraham said of Isaac. He is the son of my old age. In Joseph's mind, in Jacob's mind, Joseph was the child through whom the promise would come, right? At least that's how Jacob is seeing it. He gives him this robe, and here what the brothers sought to do was to basically break the dreams, to take Joseph's prophetic dreams and see that they don't come to pass. They sought to alter God's providence, right? And that's something that unbelievers do all the time, right? They seek to alter God's providence. Romans 6:23 says what? The wages of sin is death. That's the ultimate providence. That's the ultimate end for anybody who rejects God. The wages of your sin will be death. But what do unbelievers tend to do? Well, they reject God. They say, well, my good will outweigh my bad. I'm gonna try to be a good person. Everything they do is to avoid their outcome. Everything they do is to avoid God's providence. Everything they do is meant to, in a sense, rebel against having any kind of authority over us. Just think of the parable Jesus tells about the vineyard workers and the vineyard workers, or it's a different parable, but basically they say, we will not have this man to be king over us, right? So you've got this, people are trying to do this all the time, which is to alter God's providence. God had given Joseph a dream in which his brothers would bow to him. His brothers didn't like that, so in an attempt to change their fate, they said, let's kill our brother. We'll show God, right? We'll change the history here a little bit. So that's what they do. So they throw him into a pit, and that now brings us to verses 25 through 28, where we see here Joseph is sold into slavery. So apparently Reuben goes off, right? He's like, let's not kill him, let's just throw him into this pit. And then he leaves for some reason. And now Judah is there, and they throw him to a pit, and they're having a meal. I'm just trying to picture this dynamic here, right? Joseph's in some poor pit right over there, and he's probably wailing, he's like, let me out, let me out. And his brothers are a distance away having a meal. It's like, I mean, that's twisted, don't you think? You know, your own brother is sitting there in the pit, let me out, let me out. And they're like, hey, pass the salt, will you, please? You know. So Judah's like, you know what? Why should we kill him? Let's make a profit. Let's sell him into slavery. That's a good idea. Why should we? So look what he says here, verse 25. And they sat down to eat a meal. Then they lifted their eyes and looked, and there was a company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels, bearing spices, balm, and myrrh. By the way, that caravan just so happened to be coming from Gilead, right? Just so happened to be coming in the right direction to going into Egypt. So they got their camels bearing spices, balm, myrrh on their way to carry them down to Egypt. So Judah said to his brothers, hey, I've got an idea, guys. If we kill him, we don't earn anything out of it. Let's sell him to these Ishmaelites. And then somehow trying to rationalize it, let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother in our flesh. 5 seconds ago, they were planning to kill him. And then it's like, he's our brother. Let's not kill him. Come on, Judah, you're better than this. And by the Lord's grace and mercy, he will be better than this. But right now, this is not exactly Judah's finest moment. Let's not kill him. Let's sell him. In other words, whatever happens, it's like a que sera, sera, right? Whatever happens will happen. If we sell him into Egypt, he'll probably die. He'll die in some, whatever. And it won't be our fault because we will not have laid a hand on him. Right? As if God's going to be like, oh, I guess you're right. It's not your fault because you didn't kill him. So they sell him to these Midianite traders or these Ishmaelite traders. Now, some people like to make a big deal about the fact that it says Ishmaelites and then Midianites. Well, which is it? It's a contradiction. No, one term is more generic. The other one's more specific. It would be the same thing if I said, so a group of Europeans came and then the brothers picked them up and sold them to the Italians. Okay? It's effectively the same thing. To say Ishmaelites is a general term. To say Midianites is the more specific term there. So, no, skeptics, you're not right. The Bible does not contradict itself here. And they sell them for 20 shekels of silver, which was apparently the going price of a slave in those days. So they pick them up out of the pit. They sell them to these slave traders or these spice traders. They're like, sure, we'll go into the human trafficking business as well. There's a little bit of money in that as well. And they take them and they're on the way to Egypt. And Joseph is going on his way to Egypt. Now again, let's not, the invisible hand of God is working here, right? It just so happened that this caravan was going in the right direction, right? At the right time when the brothers are there and Joseph's in the pit. What if they were coming from Egypt going the other direction, right? What if the brothers had decided to kill Joseph? Again, all these things, God is working behind the scenes. He's not condoning the sin of the brothers, but he's working to accomplish his purposes through their sin. As we'll see, just look ahead to chapter 45, verses 5 through 8. That's chapter 44. There we go. So Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. I know I'm skipping ahead a little bit here, but he says in chapter 45, verse 5, "But now, do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me here before you to preserve life. For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God, and he has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt." Now Joseph can say that later. In the pit, he's not thinking that. In the pit, he's like, I hate my brothers, and if I ever get out of here, and if I ever find a way to do it, I'm going to get even with them, right? But eventually he's going to learn to see and get this sort of glimpse of God's providence. He's going to have wisdom, age to kind of look back on these things, and he's going to see God's hand in all of this. Now, oftentimes we don't get to see the Lord's hand of providence working in our lives, but sometimes you do. Sometimes you can look back and you can say, man, I really can, usually it's in retrospect, but you look back and you're like, wow, the Lord really worked to bring me from point A to point B, right? When I was in point A, I was thinking, wow, this is really bad. But now you're in point B and you're like, now I see the Lord working in all this. And it was bad. It doesn't negate the badness of it, but the Lord brings good out of a lot of these things and redeems a lot of these things in this life. And even if he doesn't, you still have eternal life, right? So there's that to look forward to as well. But here, all of this is God's hand working in and through even the sinful actions. And that's the thing. And we need, of course, to recognize that even though God is working in all this, he is not the author of sin. The brothers are still responsible for everything they do. And that's the great mystery, right? How God can be sovereign and in control of all things, yet we are still responsible for our choices. How does that work? I don't know how exactly that fits together. That's what the Bible teaches, and that's what I believe. So, we have to take both of these things. Don't try to absolve God of blame by saying he's not in control. That's oftentimes what you see, right? So the people who are like very much in the free will camp, they say, well, God doesn't override our free will. He just hopes that we do better, and then, but we are responsible. But he's not the author of these things. He's not sovereign. It's like, no, he is sovereign. Don't deny his sovereignty. Because if you don't have a sovereign God, what's the point? Evil becomes a bit of a problem to try to explain away. But if God's not sovereign, what's the point? Why would I pray to a God who's not sovereign? It's like, well, I'll try to do better for you. I'll try to do good for you, but I can't promise anything. It's like, well, yippee, thanks. That doesn't bring me any comfort as a Christian to say that God really wants to try hard but may not be able to pull this off. No, I want the God that says, look, you're going to go through that dark valley, but I'm going to be there with you, and I'm going to bring you through to the other side. That's the kind of God I want. That's the kind of God I'd like to worship. Yeah, it's going to be hard in the here and now, but I know that this life is not all there is, right? In fact, this is just a drop in the bucket compared to eternity. So that's the kind of God I like to have. So we may never see how God providence works its way through our lives, but it does. And that's why we're called then by the scriptures to live by faith. Well, that brings us now to the final section here, verses 29 to 36, as Jacob mourns. Now, of course, it begins with Reuben returning to the pit. So he had this plan to try to get back into his father's good graces. He steps away, and his brothers ruin his little plan to get back. And he comes back, and he's like, where's Joseph? He's like, where'd he go? And he said, well, we sold him to slavery. And Reuben's like, he tears his clothes, and he mourns like, oh, how am I going to come back to my dad now? The lad is no more, and where shall I go? So they have this plan. So they take Joseph's tunic, they kill the goat, they dip the tunic in the blood of the goat, and then they sent the tunic of many colors ahead and brought it to their father and said, now notice this. Notice the lie. It's not an outright lie. They just say, hey, we found this. Is this your son's? In other words, it's like, hey, here's this robe. And then they let Jacob come to his own conclusions. Very sneaky. Very, very, very sneaky. As they say here, they don't outright lie. They just show Jacob the tunic and allow him to make his own conclusions, which he does. Verses 32 and 33. We have found this. Do you know whether this is yours? And notice they don't even say, our brother. Is this your son's? Is this your son's tunic or not? And he recognized and said, it is my son's tunic. A wild beast. Now, I guess I can forgive Jacob a little bit, right? Because he did favor Joseph. But he just goes off into it's like a wild beast. It's like, well, okay, all you have is a bloody tunic. You're kind of jumping to conclusions here, particularly if you know your sons at all, okay? Maybe you should think, what's the source of this information that you're getting, right? The source of this fake news. But he's like, a wild beast is eating him. Without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces. So then Jacob tears his clothes and puts sackcloth on his waist, and he mourned for his son many days. Now there's a little bit of irony here, because how did Jacob, with the help of his mother, deceive his brother Esau? Did it not involve some goats? And did it not involve some of his brother's clothing? A little bit of irony there, don't you think? Right? And again, we see Jacob, the deceiver, being deceived. Right? He was deceived by his uncle, father-in-law, Laban. He's deceived now by his own sons. Right? And they use, right? What did they put on Jacob's arms to deceive Isaac? Well, goat hair, right? He put on his brother's clothing, and you see goat in a brother's piece of clothing. A little bit of irony going on here. And then Jacob mourns. Now, his mourning is both understandable and a little regrettable. It's understandable in the sense that this is the perceived loss of the son of promise, right? What I said earlier, Jacob, in his mind, had sort of elevated Joseph to the firstborn status, and it assumed that the promise that was given to Abraham, passed on to Isaac, passed on to Jacob, would be passed on to Joseph, that Joseph would be the next in the line of promise. And with him dead, well, what's Jacob's conclusion now? God's promises are broken, right? Joseph's dreams are broken, his dreams are shattered, and God's promises are broken because the son of promise is dead. Now, it's also regrettable because, and we know this, Jacob would not mourn this way for any of his other children. Right? When his daughter was raped in Genesis 34, he was just like, that's too bad. That's a very bad thing. Let's not do anything to make things worse, right? And then when his brothers are like, and his sons are like, should these people mistreat our sister? He's like, you made me a stench in the nostrils of the Shechemites. So he doesn't mourn the rape of his sister, but he does mourn heavily the loss of his favored son. Remember, he's the firstborn of his favorite wife. So that's what is going on here. And again, in Jacob's defense, he probably thought that Joseph would be the heir of the promise and the covenant that was passed down from Abraham and Isaac. So in his mind here, the promises of God have failed. Now, as all this is going on, you get this little verse at the end of the section here in verse 36. Now the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. So Joseph is not dead, right? Joseph is now in Egypt, and he's been sold to Potiphar, and you're going to have to wait 2 chapters until you see what happens to him later, right? He comes back on the scene in Genesis 39. We're going to have a sidetrack next time in Genesis 38 with Judah and Tamar. But the brothers thought that he would probably just die, perhaps just die on the way there. His father thought he was dead for sure, torn into pieces by an animal. And here we see, in a sense, like a resurrection, right? Joseph is out of the pit, and he's safe. And what he's going to do is he's going to save his brothers, right? He's going to save his family. As I said, Genesis 37 is one of these chapters in the Bible where God is not mentioned at all, but it's clear that he's working. He is clearly working. All these coincidences, the man who finds Joseph in the field, the caravan that happens to be going in the right direction, the change of mind of the brothers who wanted to kill him, all of these things are God's invisible hand of providence working through the events here in Joseph's life. And Joseph, who had gone to check on the shalom of his brothers and the shalom of the flock, is going to bring shalom to his family a few chapters later, right? When he saves them, when he delivers them from the famine. So in that sense, then, you can say that Jesus, or Joseph, is a type of Jesus in this sense, right? Think about the parallels here, right? Joseph was called by his father to go check on his brothers. Jesus is on a mission sent by his father to check on his brothers, right? His own people. John's gospel begins, it says, Jesus was sent to his own, but his own did not receive him, right? And the same thing here. Joseph was sent to his brothers, but his brothers beat him, stripped him, and left him for dead, which is exactly what the Israelites did, what the Jews did to Jesus when he was sent to save them, to bring them shalom, right? Jesus came to bring shalom, yet the Jews did not receive him. They beat him and left him for dead. But like Joseph, Jesus was raised out of the pit, right? Jesus came out of the grave 3 days later after he was killed to bring shalom to his people. All this because God is sovereign, right? God is sovereign, working all these things. And all these things that are happening in real history are also meant to point us to Christ. Because Jesus says, right, the scriptures bear witness to me. He tells the disciples on the road to Emmaus, he says, let me tell you about how the prophets, the law, and the Psalms are all written about me, right? He says this in John. He says, you search the scriptures because you think that in them you have life, but it is they that bear witness to me. So all of these things that are happening in real life are still pointing in a way to Christ. How Christ brings shalom, how Christ was left for dead, how Christ came out of the grave in a sense, just as Joseph came out of the grave. And because of all of this, then the words that Paul says in Romans 8:28 really ring true, right? How God works all things for the good of those who love him, right? For those who are called according to his purpose. We may not see that. And who knows, we may not see that in our lives. But we know that all things are still working together for our good and for his glory, right? So I'll leave it at here. Next time, Lord willing, on the 6th of July, we'll look at the story of Judah and Tamar and why this is such a interesting break in the narrative to interrupt. It's like, wait a second, what about Joseph in Egypt? It's like, well, let me tell you about Judah first. Like, all right, we'll wait a chapter to pick up on the Joseph story, but we'll stop here.